All right, so this is a continuation from class of the current industrial issues lecture. And I think for most of the classes, you're going to be somewhere around here, which are what we're going to start with trading blocks. If you are past this, you are welcome to fast forward. But I think almost everybody got to trading blocks. So that's where I'm going to begin. Okay, in class, we took a look at current industrial issues on a couple of different what we call scales. So we took a look at the city scale, right, where we're starting to see the migration of factories moving from urban cores to just outside the suburban areas, the urbanized area, to the rural areas where land is cheaper, but yet they're still close enough for things like infrastructure and a labor market. Then we changed scales and we talked about in terms of a country issue. And so we looked at the United States and saw how factories are moving from traditional cores of like the East Atlantic and what we call now the Rust Belt. And that is starting to deglomerate and move to the Sun Belt, which are, most of the southern states. And now what we're going to do is we're going to change scales yet again, and we are going to talk about the global trends in industry worldwide. And so we're going to start with what are called trade blocks. Now, a trade block or a trade agreement like this is some sort of intergovernmental agreement. So the United States is making, its government is making an agreement with another country, another state. And they're probably doing something to eliminate or reduce trade barriers. In other words, they want to create a system kind of like what we have here in the United States, where if I'm California, I can trade freely with Colorado. Anytime that we reduce trade barriers, we're more likely to trade with another place. And typically we've created these trade barriers to protect domestic manufacturing of something. But what we've seen is that global trade has evolved to such a point that we've kind of figured out what we can be competitive in and what we can't be. So we can be competitive in things like automobiles. So, we have done things to create advantages for us in terms of other countries that try to sell automobiles, while at the same time, we know we can't be competitive in like textile manufacturing. And so, we have done things like outsourcing. But when it comes to the countries with whom we want to trade with the most, we have gone to this tactic of creating a trade block. And that trade block means that we probably trade with these countries almost more than any other countries on Earth. And typically we see trade blocks geographically made with countries in close proximity to one another. And so the example that I'm going to use for a trading block is NAFTA. And we've talked a little bit about NAFTA before, but let's just review. It's the North American Free Trade Agreement, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And that FNT in NAFTA, it really says it all about the trading bloc. This is where Canada, the United States, and Mexico, it's not all of North America, but it's these three major countries in North America, they have agreed to get rid of any kind of tariffs or trade barriers from them. And so they can freely trade with one another. Okay? Some other examples would be like the European Union. If you're in South America, Mercosur. One of the ones in Asia is ASEAN, which is ASEAN is the, basically the free trade zone of Southeast Asia nations, and that's the ASEAN part. And so there's a lot of these around the world, and we see this regionally almost anywhere you go. I think you guys in your Unit 4 test, you read a little blurb about international versus supranational organizations. And the question was about a group called ECOWAS, which is a trade bloc in Africa. So almost any place we go in the world today has these trading blocks, and those are a couple of good examples of them. All right, so just to reiterate, these are created mainly between your main trading partners geographically. Typically, what we see is that trade increases for everyone, and this is good for everyone. Now, there are some exceptions. Let me just give you one as an example. For the most part, when the United States and Mexico and Canada entered into NAFTA, for all three countries overall for their economy, it was definitely good. But when we created something like maquiladoras, think about who that hurt in America. That hurt the people working in factories in America. They lost their jobs. Obviously this helped Mexicans who could now work in factories in Mexico. So it was good for them. But then there's other parts about NAFTA where it hurts Mexico. So for example, in agriculture, like farm production of corn, the American government historically has subsidized the living daylights out of corn production. And so it's made it very cheap to produce corn. And then our corn farmers then, because they can now freely do it and there's no tariff or import tax, they can sell their corn in the Mexican market and they can way undersell, Mexican corn farmers. And so we want to be careful. We would want to say for individual groups, trading blocks may not be 100% great, but overall for the country, as we can see with the global trend, these countries would not be entering into these agreements unless it was good for them. And we're seeing this as a global trend. Almost every major country around the world is involved in a trading block. So it's overall, it's a good thing. Now remember, and I'm going to tie this back to Unit 3, we talked about something called an international organization and a supranational organization. What separates the two is when you cede some aspect of sovereignty. And in a trading block, you're ceding the aspect of having the ability or the power to create a tariff. And when you give up that right, now because you can't do it unless you break that agreement, but if you uphold that agreement, you're really ceding a part of your sovereignty. So what we would say is that trading blocks are supranational organizations. Okay, next. We talked in class about foreign direct investment. Or just, I'm going to go through this really quickly, but FDI is something that really we see as a global trend. And we typically see FDI going from MDCs to LDCs, especially in low value added goods. But when we talk about something like high value added goods, we're seeing a lot of FDI go from MDC to MDC. So like America's TNCs, our transnational corporations, may be investing in building a factory in a place like England or in Germany. And we talked about in Made in the USA, you've got Germany building $1 billion plant in the United States. That's FDI as well. So anytime that a foreign country's companies invest capital, investment capital into your economy, that is FDI. Right? And so you're investing money in land, building a factory, new machinery, and that's going to create jobs. And so if you're like the LDC, you want this. You want that transnational corporation to come to your country because you're having trouble probably if you're an LDC creating economic activity, and they're going to do it for you. And so you're going to want to entice them. Right? You're going to want to lure them. And how could you do that? So what we see is that these LDCs are a lot of times competing for MDC capital investment. They're competing for that FDI, that foreign direct investment. And so what countries have done is they have created special economic zones. And sometimes we call these export processing zones. And we call them that because typically most of the stuff that's made in those zones, those SEZs, they're probably not going to be sold within the country that they're made. And so we use the example of maquiladoras. Probably 98% of all the stuff that was made in northern Mexico was not being sold in Mexico. It was being sold into the United States. It was being sold directly for the purpose of exporting back to the United States. And those MDCs were lured by cheap land costs, by cheap property taxes, by cheap rail freight costs. So if you have to use a railroad, to get your goods to the coast, you'd get it for a really cheap rate. And so we need to recognize that this happens on multiple scales. Not only does this happen country to country, this also happens within our country. So, you need to think of like Colorado is competing with other places. Colorado's competing with Kansas and with Arizona for capital investment. And it doesn't always have to be FDI. It doesn't always have to be from another country. Let's say that Google wants to put in a campus and they're either going to do it in Phoenix or Seattle or Denver. I mean, really, we're trying to lure them, and we have to do that to try to help our economy. And if we don't do it, then that capital investment goes to those places and it helps them out. And so this is what This is what LDCs try to do a lot of times to get those MDCs. Hey, come to our country, come to our country. This is what we'll do for you. We've got good infrastructure. We have a solid government. We have very little ethnic conflict. This is a good place for you to do business. Okay. Now, I gave you maquiladores, and you can certainly use that as your example. But the example I typically use is Guangdong, China. So there you can see a Ford plant in Guangdong, China. Guangdong is in the very southeastern part of China. You can see that effectively that Hong Kong is a part of that. But this is an area where China has gone to great lengths to build infrastructure, to create laws that are beneficial to multinational, or what we call transnational corporations. The laws and rules they're a little bit different than the rest of China. The tax rates are different. The freight rates are different. The property costs are different for MDCs than they are for other companies that are actually from China. This is an area that specifically caters to multinational corporations or transnational corporations of other countries. Okay? So that's called a special economic zone. And hey, if you want to use that maquiladora as an example, that's a good example of an SEZ as well. Okay. All right. Now we're going to kind of switch topics, and we are going to talk about the generation of economic activity. And so remember that really our focus here in Chapter 11 is secondary economic activity, the processing of raw materials into finished goods. Now, this will also work, and actually the example that I use is not going to be about a manufactured good. So this is going to work for services as well. So I want you to understand that in the big picture scheme of things, when we start tying ideas together, certainly this would work for secondary economic activity, but it also works for tertiary activity as well when we get to Unit 6. And so this is kind of a big picture idea called the economic base model. All right. The economic base model says that to generate significant economic activity, you have to have some sort of industry or service that is well funded with investment and that people need. And it's something that's big enough to create hundreds, if not thousands, of jobs directly. But then what's really important is that economic base model says that you are going to create literally thousands of jobs that are indirectly related to the base activity. Okay, so let's kind of get into this. All right, so a basic economic activity, that's what everything starts with. That's kind of the center point when we kind of take a look at the bottom right-hand corner, and you can identify in the gray there a core industry, okay? And that core industry is what drives the economy. It's what creates hundreds of jobs. And without that basic economic activity, the rest of the other stuff, the other services and the other jobs, they're going to suffer as a result of that not being there. All right, so a basic economic activity is typically seen by outside investment. So it could be, certainly FDI, or it could be, in the case of, I guess a good one would be like, I don't know, let's use a ski area. Okay, a ski area, if you think about it, a lot of the money that's generated by a ski area, that money comes from some other place. For people traveling all over the country, from investors that are invested in the ski area that may not even live in that ski area. So let's use the Aspen ski area. And what ends up happening is that the Aspen ski resort, it drives the economy of Aspen. And everything kind of succeeds and fails to some degree based on that basic economic activity. You take out that ski area in Aspen, and actually, if you know Aspen very well, they have like 4 of them. But if you take out Aspen Mountain, then all the grocery stores, the restaurants, the motels, the gas stations, all those other things that have proliferated because of the the basic economic activity, the base activity, all those other things will suffer. In other words, Aspen's economy is not driven by a gas station or a sports clips or a grocery store. Okay? Those things are the result of a healthy basic economic activity. The basic economic activity is what drives the economy in that area. Okay, so let me use just a couple of examples, and I think a good one to think about is Denver International Airport. And obviously, I've used a couple of services, but the same thing works. If we put a steel factory in a city like Pittsburgh, that's going to be what drives the economy, and then all the other stuff that develops around that proximity of that steel plant, those are going to be what we call secondary activities. Okay, but if you take that steel plant out, that steel factory, the other things are going to suffer as a result. So I'm going to use DIA for my example, Denver International Airport. I remember when Denver International Airport was first built, it was literally out in the middle of nowhere. You had to go 10 miles out in the middle of nowhere to get to it, and there was nothing out there besides the airport. But other businesses knew if they located themselves, and let's use that terminology, they agglomerated around Denver International Airport, that they would also benefit from the proximity of that basic economic activity. And so you have like restaurants and hotels and car rental places and gas stations, and all of those are what we call non-basic or secondary economic activities. I would know it either way, non-basic or secondary economic activities. These are things that provide basic services to the people that are either involved in some way with that basic industry. So maybe you're going to fly out of DIA and you need a rental car. The DIA is going to be the basic economic activity, and then the rental car agency is going to be the non-basic or the secondary economic activity. Okay. And when we see a proliferation of basic economic activity surrounded by a number of healthy non-basic or secondary activities, we call this a growth pull. And so I want you to look down at the bottom right-hand screen, and I want you to go to the top part. So if you look at that circled area of gray, you can see that there is some sort of basic or what they call a core industry. So again, let's just call it a steel factory, all right? And then all of the other services or things, either directly or non-directly, indirectly related, those are going to be your secondary activities. Those are going to be your non-basic economic activities. If you take that big dark circle out of there, out of the middle there, you take that steel plant out, all those other things are going to suffer and may go out of business as well. But once you have, a healthy basic economic activity surrounded by an agglomeration of non-basic economic activities, that's a really healthy economy in that area, and we call that a growth pull. And really what you want as a city or as a country are lots of these things. You want lots of basic activities and you want lots of non-basic, and that means that your economy is doing pretty well. That means people are employed. That means they have money to spend, and that's good for your capitalist economy. Okay? So again, a growth pull is an agglomeration or proliferation, a growth, okay, of non-basic activities around a basic activity. Remember that, hey, if you want to use, again, my DIA example for your example of the growth pull, I think that's a really good one. Because if you go out to DIA today, surrounding DIA, you've got a lot of those non-basic activities, those secondary activities. And that's, typically speaking, in a non-COVID year, that's a pretty healthy area economically for Denver. All right, next, deindustrialization. I'm going to cover this pretty quickly because I think I covered this for most of you on Monday. I just want to reiterate a couple of things. When we talk about the era of deindustrialization, that is the current global trend that we're seeing. When you have an MDC, and this really pertains only to MDCs, when you have an economy where your secondary sector is beginning to decrease because of high efficiency, robots, outsourcing, when you combine all those things together, you're going to see a shrinking of your secondary sector. And at the same time, then you should have a ballooning, a very large, healthy tertiary sector. Then we will have said you have moved into a post-industrial economy. This happens with increased levels of education. Now you can't exploit your own population anymore. You can't give them really cheap labor. Your educated workforce now is not cheap labor. And so as the result of the population having more skills, industry is going to relocate into cheaper areas, right? Okay, next concept. This has created what we call the new international division of labor. In assembly line production in a factory, we had the original assembly line production called the division of labor. Each individual worker was doing their own individual task. Right? So you might have a guy in an auto plant that all they do all day is put on the steering wheel, put on the steering wheel, put on the steering wheel. That's his job. That's that division of labor. Whereas the next person, their job was put on the headlights, put on the headlights, put on the headlights, put on the headlights. That's what we call in a factory production the division of labor, dividing up jobs into individuals. Okay, so now we're going to take it to a global concept. What we are doing now as a world is we are dividing up tasks, much like a division of labor as a country. And countries are starting to specialize into what they do best that they can provide for the global economy. So you look at like China and you think, okay, well, what's their part in the division of labor? They provide cheap labor. What is it that the United States does? They provide high value added goods. And every country kind of has their part in this division of labor in this big, world factory. That's what we call the new international division of labor. Okay. And so it's highlighted by this spatial shift of manufacturing industries from advanced capitalist countries to developing countries. And you take something like, I don't know, a Nestle Crunch Bar, right? And you really break down that Nestle Crunch Bar and you think about the various countries involved in the production of one good. That is a great example of the new international division of labor. Okay, so you don't have to look at it at one scale. You don't have to look at it as just China provides cheap labor. But what is it that countries do is their part in this global economy? So if we take something like a Nestle Crunch Bar, Nestle Crunch Bar has nuts, it has chocolate, has vanilla, there's even an aluminum wrapper. The vanilla is supplied by Madagascar. The nuts are provided by Brazil. The aluminum wrapper is from the Congo. And so if you take a look at these, all these countries have contributed, much like in an assembly line, they have contributed a particular aspect for that global product. So again, when we talk about the new international division of labor, we're talking about the roles that countries play in the global economy and how they specialize into doing specific things that they're good at for the global economy. Okay, now again, you can look at that as either an individual product like we did with the Nestle Crunch Bar, or you can take a look at it in terms of like whole countries. Okay? And you can kind of divide it up between MDCs and LDCs to do it. Remember, when we talk about the MDC and LD split, we tend to, as MDCs, we really like those countries that create SEZs. They have good infrastructure. And remember, those countries we call the newly industrialized countries. Okay. And the favorite of our newly industrialized countries are the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Now, this spatial shift in manufacturing, we figured out a cheaper, more cost-effective way to do it. Remember, that's another term that I'm not going to spend too much time on today, and that is called creative destruction. Remember, creative destruction is any time you figure out a better, more efficient way of doing something. And that is really what we've done in global production. We've figured out that we're not efficient in producing something like textiles. And so we figured out a better, more cost-effective way to do that, which is by outsourcing to LDCs. Okay, winding up in concepts here. Next concept we're going to talk about is Wallerstein's world systems theory. And you are welcome to, if I get going too fast here, pause the video, write down the stuff, and then you can come back to my voice later. All right, Wallerstein's ideas came in the early part of really the 1900s. And this is coming after really major industrial production by Great Britain, by France, Germany, the United States, and the Netherlands, among others. But what he said is that capitalism had caused this rift, this divide. You guys kind of know it as the Brandt divide, the north-south divide. Wallerstein kind of more identified with what we call the core periphery model, right? And so you have these core countries. And so Wallerstein said any country that really used capitalism, those countries where they were able to develop and industrialize first, those countries became what we know as the core, okay? And those countries that were outside of that tended to get exploited by the core, that was obviously the periphery. Okay, Wallerstein went on to say that core countries then developed highly skilled workforces that were more productive and that typically developed around tertiary activities, all right? Activities that you had to work less and you got paid more, service industries. And that one of the biggest ways that the core was able to do this was by exploiting the periphery. So let me give you a great example of this. England was probably the best country at doing this. One of the ways that they fed their factories with cheap raw materials is that they had a colonial empire. Like us, we were part of their colonial empire until we declared our independence from it. But you take a country like Jamaica. Jamaica was once a colony of England. And England exploited them to a large degree by feeding England with a cheap supply of sugar. Jamaica became this island that was largely focused on the production of sugar. And England used them. They used Jamaica to be able to develop and to gain wealth off of that. And so that's what Wallerstein says. The core countries will develop in a large part due to the exploitation of the periphery countries. However, here's what really defines Wallerstein. Even though the core countries have largely grown wealthy because of their exploitation of the periphery countries, an interesting thing happens over time, and that is that the wealth will begin to almost in a way spread back to LDCs. And so this is kind of the marker of Wallerstein. If you're asked a question of Wallerstein, typically somewhere in the answer, they're going to talk about the spread effects of wealth. And let me say that again, the spread effects of wealth. And as that happened, then that periphery country would gain enough economic wealth that it would kind of become part of a middle ground of countries called the semi-periphery. Okay. And I think a really good example for you to use for that is China. China was part of the periphery, and we have gained a lot of wealth by being able to buy cheap products. Instead of spending so much on clothing and low value added goods, we've had China make those because we've exploited them for cheap labor, and it's allowed us to become kind of wealthy. But by us putting factories in China, creating jobs, their standard of living has slowly but surely come up. And now wealth is spreading to them to the point where now they're kind of in a middle ground. They're in that semi-periphery. So we have core countries, semi-periphery countries, and then periphery countries. And then at the lowest end, you'd have external. And there's really not much external. So we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about that. But I want to focus on the semi-periphery. Semi-periphery are going to be like the BRICS. Okay. Semi-periphery are going to be these countries that are, coming out of Vietnam is getting to the semi-periphery. Turkey is getting to the semi-periphery. Greece is getting to the semi-periphery. But I think China and India are probably our two best examples of what we would call today semi-periphery countries. And what's kind of interesting is now they're starting to exploit periphery countries for the wealth that they're gaining. Okay, and we talk about this at length, but remember that those peripheral countries supply the core countries with cheap raw materials, with cheap labor, and eventually Wallerstein says that wealth will kind of spread. Now, the core states, they by far benefit the most, and we have a term for this called uneven development. All right, and so Wallerstein is all about the spread effects. And that it's not static, it's dynamic. You can move from the periphery to the semi-periphery to the core. We know that the Four Asian Dragons did this, but that you need to understand that the MDCs, the core countries, they were growing at a much faster rate than these periphery countries are that move into the semi-periphery. All right, so again, when you think of Wallerstein, you can kind of think of a core periphery model. But I would also kind of think about, hey, look, when I hear the word spread effects, where these core countries, they exploit in the long run, they're exploiting these periphery countries. But if these countries are smart, they do their ROSTO right, they're going to be able to move into the semi-periphery, and then like India and China will very soon move into the core countries. So it's not static; it's a dynamic, changing kind of system. Now, at the opposite end of this is what we call dependency theory. Now, I've alluded to this many times, but I have never really made you have a key term card for it. So let's make a key term card for it. And it's a much more static kind of thing than Wallerstein. So whereas Wallerstein says, hey, look, you can move from the periphery to the semi-periphery to the core. It's dynamic, it's changing. Dependency theory is not that. Dependency theory states that international trade results in dominant states and dependent ones. It's static. It's not dynamic. There's not a lot of change. And so dependency theory would argue that countries like Mali are going to remain dependent countries for a very, very long time. They're not going to move into the core anytime soon. And that it's, dependency theory says that even a country like China, who is coming up, they couldn't have done it without the help of the United States. And so even them, China, they are dependent upon a country like the United States for their development. If the United States pulled out, then then China wouldn't be able to develop the way that it has. And of course, you could argue that the United States would be hurt by this too, but I'm sure we'd just go exploit another country. Okay, so what do the dependent states rely on the dominant states for? Well, remember that they're lacking capital. They're lacking capital for investment into economic activity. So like for factories and things like that. And so they need loans, they need money. And remember that one of the ways that LDCs do this primarily is through the World Bank. And that is mostly money from MDCs, okay? They need help with healthcare. So if they have issues in terms of diseases and things like that, I'm thinking of like Ebola, where are they going to get the vaccines for that? They're going to get it from MDCs. Okay, if they need some sort of agricultural technology, they've got to get it from an MDC. And by the way, once they make manufactured goods, what countries are going to buy those manufactured goods from them? Oh, that's right, the MDCs, because they're the ones that have the money to buy those products from them. And if you are an LDC and you're competing with other countries to sell goods to like the United States is going to exploit that situation by trying to buy from the cheapest one. Okay, so dependency theory says that all these things, the dependence on capital, on development, and market for trade goods, these things all are going to reinforce dependency. Now, one of the ugliest forms of dependency theory is this idea of neocolonialism. So this should be, I think this is the last topic for today. When we talk about neocolonialism, let's just get the neo part out of there and talk about colonialism again. So we talked about in Unit 3, colonialism / imperialism. And the idea that should come out of colonialism or imperialism is you have a foreign power and they come to your country and they basically take over in some way. They either take your land, that's what colonialism is, or in imperialism, they are going to dominate your political, social, and economic structures. They may take over your government. They may tell you what language to speak. That's taking over your social. And maybe they institute, kind of like England did to us, a colonial system where you had to trade only with that mother country. Okay, that would be controlling their economic systems. So call it whatever you want, colonialism or imperialism. But what it is, it's a foreign power's control over you. Well, what we're seeing today as a global trend is that instead of directly taking over countries, we have been sort of doing this through the global economic system, and that is called neocolonialism. Okay, neo just means new. So it's like a new form of colonialism. So it's the use of economic pressures, whether that's tariffs, whether that's exploiting them for cheap labor. Maybe it's like, hey, if you guys don't do this, we'll go to Indonesia instead of China. So it's some way that MDCs are, kind of indirectly controlling the economic institutions of LDCs. And they do that to exploit them in some way, shape, or form. It's kind of seen globally. If you go and take over another country, that kind of makes you look bad today. And there's kind of a culture of countries that aren't really supportive of that like they were in the 1800s. What I want to iterate to you is that this is still kind of happening, but just in a different way. We're doing it through economic pressures. So it could be an embargo against like Cuba, where we refuse to trade with them, and that sort of forces them to do what we want them to do. It could be like economic sanctions, so that we prevent other countries, or we discourage other countries that are our allies from trading with a country like Iran if they develop like a nuclear program. And so we're not directly controlling the country, but we're using our economic advantages as core countries to pressure those LDCs to basically do what we want to do, what we want them to do. And that is called neocolonialism. Okay, so here's some examples that you can use, right? In terms of like capital, we the MDCs control interest rates. So if we want to really exploit those LDCs and pressure them, we can tell them, hey, if you want our money, then you have to pay a high interest rate on your loans. We can put in, like the World Bank does, structural adjustment programs where we now have control over what they spend their money on. Remember that MDCs have most of the capital, so they are the ones largely responsible for FDI. And remember that we're going to go wherever a country can entice us the most, and so that kind of forces them to do what we want them to do. Okay, we're the ones that have the efficiencies. We're the ones that have the established comparative advantages. We're the ones that make, as MDCs, the best global products. And you got to work pretty hard as an LDC to compete. And I'm talking about things like, I don't know, automobiles. Hey, look, India, you want to make automobiles? Great. Go ahead. Good luck. We've been making them for like 150 years, and we're pretty dang good at it. And we have such high efficiency. Like, we have robots that can make them. We have computer programmers and engineers that know how to do it very cheaply compared to what you're going to do. And probably not only are we going to be able to do it cheaper, but we're going to be able to do it with higher quality. And the rest of the world's going to want our automobiles instead of your automobiles. So that's what I mean by established comparative advantages. And then the last thing is, really, if you're going to try to develop, if you're going to try to take off as an LDC, one of the things that they rely on is the selling of their raw materials. The problem for them is that a lot of times they can't do anything with their raw materials. They can't process and transform them. So oil's a good example. They can sell oil, but can they process it and refine it into gasoline? And if the answer is no, then sometimes there's only so far that their economy can take them, whereas those MDCs, they have the ability to process it and sell their gasoline that an LDC has made for a bigger profit than what the LDC originally sold it for. All right, so that is neocolonialism. Okay, that should be the rest of current industrial issues. You should be done with chapter 11. Hey, make sure you study, go back over those key terms, and we'll see you next week.